Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, guys, we have to do something. We must make them pay. That is the sentiment undergirding our response right now to Putin's war in Ukraine. And I have to tell you, I totally get it. Seeing the images of apartment buildings blown up, civilians maimed, civilians killed, an ominous 40-mile-long military convoy looming outside of Kyiv, the completely natural human response is we cannot allow these horrible deeds to go unpunished. That's to say nothing of the potentially broader threat that Putin's actions here in Ukraine represent. Will he stop at Kyiv? Will he leave NATO countries unmolested? Will he be satisfied until his own imperial ambitions are realized? But as I watch our response, I fear we have casually embarked on a course of action that is unlikely to deter further war and instead may rush us towards it. Specifically, in our quest to do something, we have embarked on a program of unprecedented sanctions that will not only hurt Putin and his oligarchs, but will decimate the entire Russian economy. Not only did we kick major banks out of SWIFT, but for the first time in history, we have sanctioned a G20 central bank. We are directly attempting to force a complete collapse of the ruble. In other words, we have, with very little debate, committed ourselves to all-out economic warfare. And if history serves as a guide, that economic warfare will be just as brutal and just as devastating for our opponent as conventional warfare would be. It's just instead of civilians dying from bombs and bullets, it will be famine that sends innocent people to their graves. We must consider carefully the morality of those human costs, but to really analyze what we're doing from a tactical perspective, we need to first be specific about what our goals are here. It may be unpopular to say, but I actually don't really care about punishing the oligarchs or Putin or making sure anyone pays a price. I care about peace, ending the war in Ukraine, and even more importantly, averting a broader war, preventing nuclear annihilation. Those are the stakes, and that is what I care about. And unfortunately, the historical record on broad punishing sanctions makes it pretty clear. They are more likely to push leaders to war than to bring about peace. First of all, let's have a little bit of context. There's a lot of speculation right now that Putin might be ill, either mentally or physically, that he might have become paranoid and detached from reality during these long years of COVID quarantine. Any or all of that might be true, but you don't actually have to assume a terminally ill or clinically insane Putin to expect that he might lash out in ways that would seem insane if he's pushed. Now, we've talked here about the political science concept of gambling for resurrection. That is a fancy way of saying that people backed into a corner will take big risks, including doing seemingly crazy things. Putin is down big at the poker table here. Is he going to cut his losses and walk away? That's unlikely. Instead, he is likely to double down, placing big bets with a slim chance of payoff and the desperate hope that he can still come out on top. The more that we back him into a corner, the more likely that outcome becomes. And that's not crazy. It's just typically irrational human nature. Add on top of that a massive ego and nationalistic fervor of the type reflected in comments coming out of Russian state media. Consider what we brought you before, Pravda publishing this op-ed stating that, quote, the little red buttons may seem the only viable alternative to a humiliating defeat. That type of nihilistic doomsday analysis should be enough to persuade you that the threat is in fact credible, that Putin would actually contemplate total destruction to avoid painful humiliation at the hands of the West. In fact, with his wild miscalculations in a wholesale invasion of Ukraine, he has already proven that that is the case. History also provides terrifying cautionary tales about the actual response to sanctions versus what we wish cast the response would be. In fact, the last time we sanctioned a great power was in the buildup to World War II. The use of sanctions had been pioneered and codified by the League of Nations, which required automatic collective embargoes of any nation starting an aggressive war. The aim of this pact was, of course, noble. Liberals believed that the very threat of financial warfare would be enough to deter hostile actors from aggression. Instead, those sanctions, that threat of sanctions, had the exact opposite impact. According to Henry Farrell, writing at Lawfare, sanctions instead spurred Italy, Germany, and Japan to take aggressive actions in an attempt to make their nations impervious to the threatened financial attacks. We've already discussed a few times how sanctions taken casually with little debate by the U.S. government emboldened Japanese hardliners who viewed U.S. sanctions as an overt and aggressive act of war, pushing the government into what was clearly an irrational move, striking our forces at Pearl Harbor and drawing us off the sidelines and into the war. The threat and imposition of sanctions on Germany may have had even more perverse results. According to Farrell, quote, The Nazi leadership saw the threat of foreign sanctions as further justifying its hegemonic ambitions. The more territory it influenced or controlled, the less vulnerable it would be to the Jews and Bolsheviks whom it believed were orchestrating the international campaign against Germany. In other words, far from limiting Germany's actions, Farrell argues that sanctions were a factor pushing Hitler towards additional territorial conquest. In fact, we've already seen some echoes of this behavior from Russia, which has been under some measure of sanctions since 2014. And take this with a million grains of salt. But reportedly, one intelligence analysis indicated that Putin expressed extreme anger over Western sanctions put in place in response to his attack on Ukraine and, quote, felt that the sanctions had escalated the situation faster than he expected and beyond what he considered to be appropriate. But we don't have to trust the CIA, or CNN for that matter, to see that Western leaders issued a joint statement last Saturday announcing SWIFT and central bank sanctions, and that the very next day, Putin raised the nuclear alert to high. We might see sanctions as something less than warfare, a peaceful means of pursuing noble objectives. It is very clear that the Russian government sees them as a direct act of war. And the more that Putin is attacked and backed into a corner economically, the more likely he is to strike out militarily in response. At this point, if you want peace and not retribution or some other goal, what we should be looking at first and foremost is how to give Putin an off-ramp, how to provide some sort of path that's not just face-saving, but actually meaningfully addresses the parts of his concerns which are valid in hopes of avoiding a broader conflagration. That might feel terrible. It might feel, and in reality be the case, that you are rewarding bad behavior, but it is the only viable path to an end of this conflict. This is not an easy thing for a declining superpower such as ourselves to do, because the truth is the sanctions serve an important domestic political purpose as well. They are a signal to our population that we are still the all-powerful unipolar players shaping world events to suit our ends. That's another problem with sanctions. Domestically, there is only an on-ramp, there is never an exit. The politics of removing sanctions once they've been levied are disastrous. We remove some sanctions from Iran only to have them restated under Trump. Remove some sanctions from Cuba only to also have this put back in place under Trump. In Afghanistan, our electorate is pretty much silent as our sanctions trigger a horrific famine and complete humanitarian crisis. But you can bet if we unfroze the Afghan government's assets, Democrats and Republicans would push to the mic to decry our supposed funding of terrorists. Sanctions on Russia, first levied in 2014, have only escalated, layering new sanctions on top of old ones and never going in reverse. In fact, current public sentiment is on the side of, quote, doing more, whatever that means. A Quinnipiac poll found that 57% of Americans believe our current historically devastating sanctions are, quote, not tough enough. Only 3% say they're too tough, and 29% say they're about right. In a potentially hopeful sign, however, Americans do remain committed to avoiding military conflict. What we need people to understand is that economic war, it's still war. There may not be tanks in the streets, but make no mistake, the actions we've already taken constitute a hostile act of aggression. The consequences are deadly, and our attacks pose an existential threat to the Russian nation. Removal from SWIFT, central bank sanctions, seizing of assets, not to mention cultural humiliations like blocking Russian planes from our airspace, banning Russian media, banning Russian athletes, and even firing a prominent Russian conductor from his post with the Munich Philharmonic. A network dedicated to caring for cancer patients even proudly announced they were pulling out of all Russian collaborations. Seriously, what the hell? How does punishing people who might be terminally ill serve anything other than a venal desire for revenge? France's foreign minister made the goal of all of this totally clear. We will provoke the collapse of the Russian economy. Do you think we would respond to that type of threat by declaring defeat and slinking to the negotiating table? Not a chance. We would escalate, and we would vow to make our enemy pay. Being tough, it might feel good, it might feel righteous, but starving innocent Russian civilians, some of whom have bravely taken to the streets to protest this war, is not justice, nor is it wise. In the end, our economic warfare is immoral, but more importantly, it is insanely dangerous. Maybe Putin is not the only crazy one here. And Sagar, there is a public appetite fueled by the media always to be hawkish. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it, you get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.